honest, it is a privilege to come to Denver, and particularly to the Rose Foundation, which obviously has done immense work in the world of philanthropy for a very long time, and I'm grateful that I'm getting to know more about it. This event that was organized, I have to tell you, is one of the most organized things I have ever participated in. These people are so, I showed up here yesterday and I was given a binder with 5 little tabs to tell me how my life is going to run for the morning. So it's really an honor to be part of a group that takes these things so seriously. To Elsa and Tricia, who have sort of shepherded this thing, my special thanks for making this such a seamless event. I was basically given the task of trying to put in a broad context as to why immigration has become the big issue of our times. An issue that even in my time practicing in this area was an issue a few years ago that was confined to a few social workers and a bunch of immigration lawyers generally sitting in the basement of a church. That from that, how did it turn into an issue that has grabbed the country's imagination in such a big way? How is it that an issue like immigration could help launch the presidency of Donald Trump and probably even sustain it, and some would argue actually get him the presidency? And how is it at the same time that 10,000 lawyers on short notice of 5 hours would show up at our airports around the country after the first executive order was signed, alerting us that immigration had become sort of the civil rights issue of our times? How is it that in the last 5 years, every single state legislature in our country has enforced one form, has enacted one kind or the other of immigration law for enforcement in their own states? How is it actually that the Supreme Court of the United States, in every year now, issues at least 2 or 3 major opinions on immigration? Or you would say, how is it that Congress has grappled with it and has not come to terms with the immigration debate at least since 2000? How has it paralyzed our lawmakers, and how has it paralyzed our country? Essentially, how has immigration become the third rail of American politics? Like most issues, issues like this are grounded in a combination of facts, policy, and politics. Now, you would tell me, look, that's true of almost everything in public policy, but since I know nothing about legal marijuana, I'll just stick to immigration. First of all, let me begin with a dash of history, because history is really important. And the older you go, you realize history is the only thing that teaches you anything. And our history on this is very complicated. We consider ourselves to be the ultimate nation of immigrants. This is the poster child of nation of immigrants. Let me quickly remind you, for a nation of immigrants, we have always been ambivalent about immigration. George Washington himself is known to have said that the country did not need any more immigrants except for a few skilled carpenters. Ben Franklin, who was one of our more erudite founding fathers, and many consider was the founder of modern journalism as we know it, wrote a major essay in 1755 warning the country about the Germanizing of America, and said the Germans should no longer be admitted because they don't share our liberal democratic traditions. So as I like to say, even alternative facts have long roots in our history. In 1860s, a Know Nothing Party was launched precisely to campaign against Irish and the Catholics in the electoral process. But despite all this ambivalence, we actually had no federal laws in our country regulating immigration till 1875. It will probably shock you that we have had. Immigration is one of the first things we should have regulated. We had some state laws which regulated ships coming into harbors and charging them per head that they would bring, essentially treating people as commodities, as commerce. That was our view of immigration for a very long time. Congress, for the first time in 1875, started paying attention to immigration. And it came in the context of not putting limits on immigration, what are used quantitative limits, but sort of qualitative limits. That Congress said that there are certain kinds of people we don't think we want in this country. And they focused on criminals, they focused on prostitutes, they focused on people who could not read, people who had communicable diseases, paupers, things like that, but no quantitative limits. The first major law Congress signed was in 1882, something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which for the first time said we'll no longer accept any Chinese to come after they had built our transnational railroads and we didn't need them anymore. You could put them also in the qualitative limits, as if we thought that Chinese do not merit the hospitality of our country any longer. But from 1880s to 1920s was the era of mass migration, as historians like to call in our country. And Congress started paying attention to immigration in terms of numbers in the early part of the 20th century. And theories of eugenics were actually accepted as popular science. That our social scientists convinced lawmakers that there were certain European stock who were just not as good as another European stock. Really, theories of eugenics were sold to lawmakers that some Europeans were intellectually and physically inferior to another bunch of Europeans. And that was mostly against Southern and Eastern Europeans. The campaign was against Italians, it was against Slavs, it was against Jews and Russians, that they were not as good immigrant stock as the Nordic, the English, and the Germanic populations were. And Congress, for the first time in 1917, imposed what we now call the famous national origin quota system, is that we will limit immigration by a number which was based on the number of people from that nationality in the United States in 1890s. And it was meant to exactly favor Northern and Western Europeans over Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews. And Congress passed it over President Wilson's veto. And it essentially was our law till 1965. And between 1917 and 1965, I'll only quote two things which have relevance in our history. One was during the Second World War, we interned Japanese. These were not immigrants, these were US citizens who we decided to intern just because of their national origin. This was a progressive president like FDR doing it. And FDR also is known to have restricted and frequently also stopped the Jewish migration to the United States when ships were turned away from our coast and many of them perished in the Holocaust. So we don't have exactly a very rosy history about immigration and refugee. And Congress tried to lift the national origin quota system because we thought it was a vestige of racism in 1952, and Congress overrode President Truman's veto, and the national origin quota system remained a law till 65. It was only when President Kennedy started his run for presidency that one of the first things he promised that he was going to lift the national origin quota system. And the national origin quota system was actually not lifted during Kennedy's time. He did not live to see the end of the national origin quota system. President Johnson lifted the national origin quota system. And he made it a huge priority of his. The recent history of the 65 Acts, if none of you, because we just celebrated 2 years ago the 50th anniversary of the 65 Act. Those of you of interest in this is absolutely worth reading. There's a great NPR reporter called Tom Gelton who wrote a whole book on the 65 Act based on the archival material from the Johnson Library. And his promise was, look, just tell me what had President Kennedy promised. I'm an accidental president. I'm here only because he didn't live. What had he promised? And immigration is one of the, he said, that becomes my duty to do. And Congress finally got rid of the national origin quota system, and we equalized opportunity of the world for all people from all across the country. And our picture, our profile as a nation of immigrants completely changed. So let me begin with this. This is the history of our immigration. These are the trends over time. And this, as I said, this is the beginning of the 20th century, the great high peak of immigration, and we have essentially another high peak here, which is what we are going through today. So in many ways, what country is going through today is not really much different than it was going through in the beginning of the 20th century. These are two big waves of migration. And the beginning of at that time, the foreign-born population of the United States was pretty close to about 15%. Today, the foreign-born population of the United States is inching towards 14%. I suspect by the time I come back to Denver, we'll be pretty much getting close to the high peak of per capita immigration. Now, where are these people settling? Now, for a long time, the immigration in our country was a fundamentally six-state phenomenon. These are the 6 states. Sorry, I'm not as good at this. These are the 6 states which dominated our immigration history for a very long time. This is the great 6 states of reception. That even about, if I did this speech 15 years ago, about 67% of our immigration would be in these 6 states. But now numbers are adding. There are now 3 more states in the country which have more than 1 million people. And this has just happened in the last 1 year or two. Massachusetts, Georgia, and Virginia have now joined, as I like to call, the Million Immigrant Club. But fundamentally, this was a 6-state phenomenon. And what's important about this, which is why this has become such a sharp issue in our body politic, is that there's been a huge, rapid rate in immigration. It's happened only since 1990. And these are the 14 states where the population of foreign-born people, which is what you would normally call immigrants, has gone up like 270% since 1990. Colorado has joined the list. Colorado, I won't tell you, its foreign-born population has grown about 279% since 1990. Now, this is where people are coming from. This is the list of the top 10 countries where people in the United States, foreign-born population in the United States are from. It's a very probably familiar list by now. This is Mexico and all the way down to Guatemala. What you will notice is that there's not a single European country on this list, which will tell you. If you looked at our 1965, the time when I described when President Johnson rewrote the 1965 Act, these were the top countries of admission. So you don't have to be a political genius to see that this map has completely flipped in such a short period of time. The only country which figures in both these lists is Mexico, which sent people at that time and continues to send people now. And this I put in because the refugee stuff has suddenly become an important part of our debate, that this is if you look at in our recent refugee flows, this is how it has gone in peaks and ebbs. We reached the peak of refugee admission in 1980, not surprising, this is when we took the largest number of people from after the war, end of war in Indochina. And the low point was 1977 when we admitted pretty close to 19,000 people. Now, this is where top regions of our refugee admissions in 2016. This is the Near East mostly, and Africa hugely, a very small number from Latin America and Europe and even from Asia. And if you look at this as you compare it to 1990, how different it was. This was hugely Asia. This was predominantly Southeast Asian refugees, and it was a good chunk of the former Soviet Union, mostly Jews and Pentecostals at that time. And this is where they are settling. Refugees are not going all across the country. Refugees are settling in relatively small number of states in big numbers. And these are sort of the big states in this. And you can see the numbers. Colorado, and we have the refugee coordinator, Kit, of Colorado here, who obviously knows more about this than I do. Colorado, from our numbers, took about 1,600 refugees in fiscal year 1916. That's where you are in this list. So, as I said, more than half of the refugees actually settle in about 10 states of the country. Now, this is the picture slide that summarizes good part of our discussion. Now, in our history, as I said, we have had immigrants, obviously, for a long time. We have never had this large concentration of unauthorized people in our immigration stream. 25% of the foreign-born population on the United States today is foreign-born. Never before in our history, except in recent times, is that unauthorized population actually is going down. But I'll come to that in a second. So if you read this, a pie chart of our whole foreign-born population, it's predominantly now naturalized citizens, lawful permanent who we call green card holders, and then unauthorized. And this is a list of states where at least 1/3 of the population of the foreign-born population is unauthorized. Now, if you really look at all these states, this is not the traditional 6 states of the country. So for a number of these states, their introduction to immigration actually is relatively recent. And it has unfortunately come through the lens of unauthorized immigration. I don't need to remind you that all these 12 states voted for Donald Trump in the last election. Colorado actually is almost going to be on this list. Colorado, from our estimates, is about 163,000 for unauthorized people. That is pretty close to 30% of the foreign-born population in the state. And Denver has, I think, 41,000 unauthorized people from our numbers. Now, this is, as I said, despite remarkable growth in unauthorized population, our unauthorized population is actually going down. It reached the peak in 2007, and since then, it almost every year has been coming down. But today, still about 11 million people in this country are unauthorized. Not a small number by any stretch of imagination. And these are the regions from which the unauthorized people come from. Not surprising to any one of you, about 57% of them are Mexicans. If you then add the Central Americans, we're talking about pretty close to about 80% of our foreign-born population is from one region of the world. But this is where it becomes more complicated in our body politic, is that if you look at how long these people have stayed here, of the 11 million people, a lot of them have stayed here now for a very long time. 59%, pretty close to 60%, have lived here for more than 10 years. And about 82% of them have lived here for more than 5 years. So it's not a people who just come across the border last year and have not had roots in our communities. This is a well-settled, and this is the slide that gets everyone's sort of the heartstrings. That if you look at our unauthorized population, if you look at a household, at least one parent is unauthorized, there are like 5.1 million kids in a household with at least one parent. And about more than 4 million of these people are US citizens, born in the United States. And therefore, when you think about the specter of deporting all the 11 million people, we have to contend with the fact that are we going to deport 4 million people who are US citizens by birth. Now, these are facts. These are not Republican facts and Democratic facts. These are not red state, blue state facts. These are completely facts I think almost everyone in the United States agrees. This is the general story about our immigration. Now, what about our labor market, which is very key to understanding what's happening in our country? Now, 17% of our US civilian labor force is foreign born today. But if you look at in the civilian labor force, what percentage of people have less than a high school degree, which is by definition unskilled people, that's about 53%. But on the other hand, also 17% of our labor force, which has more than a college degree, are also foreign-born people. So we have both on one, the unskilled worker and the skilled worker, a very significant proportion of our people in the labor force are foreign-born. And 5% of labor force is unauthorized, which is quite a large number. Now, you would tell me, so how did this happen? Why did our labor market suddenly change? And this, to me, is sort of one of our least appreciated phenomenon of our immigration stream, is that in 1990, when Congress last time it rewrote legal immigration, it was convinced, I was in the discussion those days, there were small memos issued by consulting firms convincing the members of Congress that we no longer need unskilled people in this country, that the country was going to need computer engineers, financial analysts, Wall Street and Silicon Valley is what was going to go. And obviously, Wall Street and Silicon Valley has been important for our country. But where the big labor market growth has happened is in the low-wage sector of our economy. And this particularly, all of you are not surprised by it. This is in construction. This is in agriculture. This is in various sectors of our service sector, from elder care to infant care to health care to janitorial services. This is where the big growth in our labor market has happened. It also happens that that sector of a labor market has systematically experienced decline in wages. If you look, taking inflation into consideration, wages today are lower than they were in 1973. The number of people enforcing our laws at the federal level is smaller than we had in 1979. And we know a number of factors are responsible for that. Enforcement is not the only one. Unionization has gone down, globalization and outsourcing has become an important part of this. But wages in the low-wage sector of our economy have systematically been going down. But the second factor on this, and not getting enough attention, is that we have become a more aging society. We are fast getting the trappings of European societies. I don't think I'll shock any one of you that baby boomers who started retiring in 2001, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring a month. By 2020, all 78 million baby boomers would have turned at least 55. By 2030, all 78 million baby boomers would have become at least 65 or older. Our estimates are that by 2030, 1/3 of US population will be over the age of 55. We are fast becoming like a European society. So for an aging society like this, what we constantly need is an infusion of economically active, tax-paying workers. And this is where one of the other unappreciated phenomena of immigration is happening. That Social Security Administration, I don't know how many of you pay attention to it, actually keeps a record of people who are making contributions, but we don't have a Social Security, at least a correct Social Security, to match those contributions. And they're actually kept in something called a suspense file. And anyone who knows about suspense files knows that these are contributions made by people who don't have the right Social Security number, perhaps therefore by default are unauthorized. Guess how much money is in the Social Security suspense file today? The last time I checked, it was $1.2 trillion. Trillion with a T. So as I keep on telling people, if you're concerned about our Social Security system, thank an unauthorized worker every day in our life. So this is about our aging society. We also become a more educated society, which is a good thing. The same thing, my favorite term, the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% Americans graduated high school. Today, 85% Americans graduate high school. which is a good thing for the society, obviously. But it has implications in the labor market. That when you have someone with a high school degree, he's not aspiring to be cleaning rooms for the rest of their lives or to work in agriculture for the rest of our lives. And that is obviously beginning to have huge impact in the labor market. So therefore, if you look at the combination of both these pull factors about how we need more workers and sort of the push factors, we have seen sort of the picture of our labor market today. So if you're a rightly educated person, you would say, well, if this is true, why don't these immigrants come through legal means and enter the labor market? So in some odd ways, supply and demand is working magically, except unauthorized legal channels are used for the demand to meet the supply. And that's really the dilemma of our immigration system. We haven't caught up in changing our immigration selection system. We have an immigration selection system which is based on a 1952 architecture for a 21st century modern economy, and it's no longer working. This is sort of the state of our legal immigration system. We admit about 1 million people every year as green card holders, which is a large number, more than any other country. In fact, combined of all the European countries, we take more people as legal permanent residents than those countries combined do. And this is the basis. About 65% of our immigration is family-based. About 15% is based on employment. Rest is what we call humanitarian, which is the refugee, and a set of diversity visas, which we pick people on the basis of a lottery every year. But each of these categories, these small charts in the pie, are backlogged. If you just look at the family immigration system, this is people coming on the basis of sponsorship from families. This is just the first. These are unmarried kids of U.S. citizens. If you are from Mexico, you have to wait 21 years to be in the green, to be eligible. If you're from the Philippines, you have to take whatever it is, 11 years. So if you're looking at, second, which is the unmarried son and daughter, and if you're from Mexico, you have to wait 21 years in the line. If you're the fourth preference, which is the siblings of U.S. citizens, these are the backlogs of almost all countries. If you're from the Philippines, you have to wait 23 years to join with your sibling in the United States for legal immigration. Now, we say that's family. What about the employment base where we really need people? So this is the state of our employment-based immigration. That if you're from this second preference are people who come with master's degrees. So if you're being sponsored by IBM and you have a master's degree and you're from China, you have to wait 4 years. If you're from India, you have to wait 8 years. And this is from people who have bachelor's degrees at least. You have to wait 12 years if you come from India and 4 years if you come from Philippines. So this is the state of our backlog, which is what a lot of people claim is responsible for what we now popularly call the broken immigration system. That we just do not have a selection system that matches the needs of our economy. Again, these are facts. These are not right-wing facts, left-wing facts. These are facts I think all of us agree. So let me now switch to policy. If these are the facts, why is policy not catching up with these facts? And actually, it is catching up with these facts. People who analyze policy for a long time, including us and people on the other side of the aisle, actually quite agree that what we need is comprehensive immigration reform, which is a combination. On one hand, we have to bite the bullet and do something about the 11 million people who are without status, because it's not good for any society to have 11 million people with compromised rights. So getting them status, whether you do this in one big swoop or you do it in staggered ways, is what everyone seems to agree on. About 65% of the country's population and almost all polls believe that we should legalize the unauthorized population. We can all disagree on the edges about how quickly that should happen, but the need to legalize is evident. We should also increase enforcement, because to have this level of unauthorized people is not good for the society. Now, we have done almost everything we can do at the border. I'll come to that in a second. Where it's generally recognized where we to do more is in the workplace, that we need to find better ways of making sure that only people who are authorized to work are actually working in the United States. And third is that we need to change the methods through which we admit people so that for future flows, people can come to take jobs in the country in a legal way as against in the unauthorized way that they're now doing. But comprehensive immigration reform hasn't happened. It has eluded the country for at least 17 years now. But in the meantime, it's not that we are at standstill on immigration. What has happened is that we have had huge rise in enforcement in the United States. Today, we spend about $19.7 billion on enforcement. Probably all of you are surprised to tell you if I tell you we spend more on immigration enforcement than we spend on the combined money that we spend on FBI, Secret Service, ATF, FDA, and the TSA. These are the major federal law enforcement agencies of the country. And immigration never gets the credit for enforcement. We spend more money on immigration enforcement than we spend on these things collectively. And we have increased the budget of the Immigration Customs Enforcement and of the Customs and Border Protection from 2005 in these numbers, which I don't have to repeat. You can read them. We have doubled the size of the Border Patrol from 2005. And if the proposals for the next year's budget go into place, we'll continue to increase them. At the same time, our removals of people would say that, look, we don't really enforce our immigration laws. No one is removed. If you really look at the removals, we reached the peak of removals about 400,000 in 2013, and we're very close to that number not as high that number in 2016 as well. So we're removing pretty close to 400,000 people a year, despite the fact that many people believe that we remove almost no one. And look at the apprehensions. This I thought, I was telling some people at dinner yesterday, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime, that the number of apprehensions at the border, people we catch at the border, has now reached historic lows in the last 5 or 6 years. We would catch about 1.7 million people in 1997. Today, last year, we caught only about 400,000 people. In 1997, about 98% of people we apprehended at the border were Mexicans. Last year, I think for the first time, we believe that majority of people we apprehended at the border were non-Mexicans. So the number of people trying to get admitted from Mexico is fast declining, and we have actually reached a historic low. Now, there are obviously many reasons for why the border crossings are going down. One is the Great Recession. Obviously, when there is less demand for work in the United States, people are not going to come. Unauthorized workers, more than anyone else, are rational actors. They just follow where the jobs are going to be. If there are not any jobs, they don't come. And we also know that we have increased border enforcement. We actually now make it very difficult for people to cross the border. There's a consequence to coming to the border illegally. In the past, we used to give a U-turn to people, and they may cross again next day or next week. We no longer do that. We catch people, we put them in criminal proceedings, they have a record, and if they try to come back, they'll be committing a felony, which is much easier for them to remove. But most importantly, which is again not appreciated enough, that Mexico has gone through a huge change. Mexico today is actually becoming a big exporter of information technology to all of Latin America. Mexico has improved its education system, so fewer people are inclined to come to the United States and take the hazardous journey than they used to do in the past. So if these are the facts about removal, and these are sort of the facts about what Congress should be doing in policy terms, why has it not happened? And this is where I say it's all about politics. Politics is at the center of this phenomenon. And we don't have, that much time to talk about politics, but let me quickly run down for you what I believe is the recent quick history on politics. That I like to think that the modern history on immigration started in 2000 when President Bush got elected in the US, President Fox got elected in Mexico. And these were two presidents who had meeting of minds on immigration. And their general belief was that we should find a willing worker to match with a willing employer. And we thought this was going to happen quickly. It did not happen. 9/11 happened actually the day before Mexican President Fox was going to address the joint session of Congress. And the 9/11 essentially made it impossible for us as a country to talk about immigration in any ways other than security lens. So nothing happened in immigration from 2001 to 2006. Congress started debating comprehensive immigration reform legislation in 2006. There was actually strong bipartisan support. Senator Kennedy, Senator McCain leading those efforts. Senate even passed a bill, but it did not become law. Because by the time we reached the 2008 election already was informing the way people were looking at immigration reform. Senator McCain, who was a big proponent of immigration reform, distanced himself from that legislation because he was running for the primaries in 2008. So Congress did not pass immigration reform. We had 2008 election. You finally elected a man who was the only person in the history who was the son of a foreign student. Constitutional scholar, we thought this was now going to happen anytime. And it didn't happen. Guess what happened? We had a big recession. It became politically impossible for members of Congress to talk about admitting more people or legalizing 11 million people at a time when we had reached a record unemployment and recession in our country. And then 2012 happened. President Obama got reelected by some estimates by a thumping majority, not in popular vote, but in electoral college vote. And everyone, both Republicans and Democrats, took from that the sign that this is now going to happen. Republicans, those of you remember from that time, Speaker Boehner himself actually went on record saying that this is going to be a priority, and this was going to happen because it was important for the Republican Party, because they saw in the Latino vote that if they don't manage to attract a good section of the Latino vote, that the Republican Party was forever going to become a minority party. To be completely bipartisan on this, Democrats read the same signal. They saw the intensity of the Latino vote, and they said, unless we keep on courting the Latino vote, we will not keep on making the electoral progress that we made. So there was an autopsy, famous autopsy done by the leaders of the Republican Party, where they said, we have to make immigration reform a centerpiece of our campaign. And guess what? Senate, by 68 votes, passed a major immigration reform bill in 2013. There were the Gang of Eight bills, 4 Republican, 4 Democratic senators who shepherded that bill. 68 votes, we don't get to almost anything in Senate these days. And Senate managed to get past this major comprehensive immigration reform bill in 2013. And everyone thought this is the year this is going to happen. Not that easily. By the time the Senate hit the House bill, the House had a totally different politics on this. Because as I like to see on issue, election is always that matters. And by the time when 2013 legislation was introduced, they were looking at the 2012 backdrop for the election. By the time it hit the House, they were looking at 2014 for their midterms. And in the Republican primary, immigration does not sell well. All it does is invite opposition from more restrictionist people. And Republican majority shied away, and Speaker Boehner finally had to abandon the idea of a comprehensive immigration reform, and the country reached another paralysis. Now, I'm mentioning the autopsy of the Republican Party because only a Washington Post reporter told me this recently, that while the Republican Party elders in their autopsy thought that immigration reform was critical, Latino vote was important to that, on the same day, at the day of the autopsy, an application was filed in the US Trademark Office in DC by a man called Donald Trump to patent the word "Make America Great Again." He had read the election in a completely different way than the orthodoxy of the Republican Party had read. And I don't have to tell you how that story ended. In 2016, you could say we produced one of the most divided results in our country, dividing the country in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. So Congress has failed to take up immigration reform for now close to 16 years. But in the absence of that, in the absence of paralysis in Congress, what we have seen is the rise in activism in the states. And this activism, I have to tell you quickly, strangely, many of you don't remember, started in Colorado. It started in 2006, the first state in the country to introduce a major, what we call omnibus immigration bills, which is bills which have more than one component on enforcement, on public benefits, on employment, was actually passed by Colorado legislature in 2006. Your attorney general at that time, whose name actually I don't remember, actually opposed the bill. He said, look, this is really foolhardy. This sounds good for effect. This is really going to be very difficult to enforce, and it's not actually going to save us any money. But the legislature passed. Colorado was then followed by a number of states, Alabama and Arizona most prominently in 2010. And the Arizona's Bill 1070 became sort of the hallmark of state activism in it, which led to the Supreme Court decision in 2014 saying that states have very minimal role in immigration. But state activism also, but obviously, has taken a new hold in light of President Trump's election. 33 states, since President Trump's election, have now introduced bills to increase the ability of the state and local cops to increase immigration enforcement. To be completely fair, many states, particularly California and Illinois, have gone on the other side of this and passing laws which sort of limit the ability of the local police and state police to engage in immigration enforcement. Again, evidence of a divided country. Now, while obviously Congress and our lawmakers are paralyzed on this issue, what about the rest of us, ordinary thinking citizens? I think for us, this paralysis does raise very important fundamental questions about who we are as Americans and the values we aspire to. I'll just start three of them. First, the rule of law, an important part of our value system. What kind of respect for rule of law are we showing when an employer on a daily basis does a wink and a nod to accept papers from people he knows are not right so that he could hire someone for a job for which no US worker is either available or willing to take that job? What does it do for our national cohesion when you have 24 states, I think 26 of the states of the country suing the President of the United States on his executive authority and 24 states opposing it? What does it mean for our national cohesion when two neighboring counties have diametrically opposite policies on immigration? I like to say that in New York, we have in Long Island and Nassau and Suffolk counties, literally next to each other, have diametrically opposite immigration policies. That if you're an immigrant who does the wrong left turn in Atlanta, Georgia, you will be deported almost immediately. But if you get caught in San Francisco, nothing is going to happen. It's not good for our national cohesion. And finally, what kind of moral values are we espousing? When we tell an unauthorized worker, look, we trust you to take care of our infant child, and we trust you to take care of our older grandmother, but we don't trust you with membership in society. These are deeply important, rooted American values, which are constantly getting threatened in our immigration dilemma today. Now, you may say that, my God, why would you feel anything optimistic about this? But I actually, strangely, feel optimistic. And why I feel optimistic about this is, again, rooted in history, which is what I started. And going back to the early part of the 20th century, when I said was the first major wave, when we imposed the national origin quota system. At that time, lawmakers were basically struggling with the same thing, that these people are not good for the country, they're not assimilating. And guess what? And these were talking about Europeans. But we know that that great wave of immigration gave rise to our own industrial revolution and ushered in the big rise of the growth of our major cities. I happen to believe that today's mass wave of immigration will be equally momentous for the future of our country. In many ways, actually, it's going to be more momentous for two reasons, just from pure historical and analytical reasons. First, it's a much more diverse wave than the wave at the beginning of the 20th century was, and diverse in two different ways. The wave of the 20th century, Europeans who came here in large numbers, were mostly relatively uneducated, relatively low-skilled people. European middle class and educated people did not migrate to the United States except for the Jews who were fleeing persecution. Almost the rest of them, they were quite happy in Europe. Today's mass migration is quite significantly highly educated and highly skilled. And let me just tell you snapshots of that, because good part of my presentation, I was focusing on the low-skilled immigration for good reason. 1/4 of our medical doctors today are foreign-born. The number I heard recently, and I was really struck by, that if you look at the 7 major top cancer research centers in our country, 42% of scientists in those are foreign-born. If you look at one third of our computer engineers are foreign-born. If you look at PhDs, 53% of our PhDs last year were foreign-born in computer sciences. 47% of our PhDs in math were foreign-born. About 56% of our PhDs in engineering were foreign-born. If you look at the startup companies in Silicon Valley, shifting to Silicon Valley, which have a valuation of more than $1 billion, 51% of these startup companies were started by an immigrant. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, people tell us now that 40% of our Fortune 500 companies were founded either by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. And the thing that tickles me the most, in 2016, US won 6 Nobel Prizes. It's, I think, one of the highest in our history. All 6 were foreign-born. So when you really look at the diversity of the immigration on the skill and education base, it's hugely changed from the time of the early part of our 20th century. The second part of diversity is the geographic and the religious and the ethnic background of these people. Today, we have people from all parts of the world because of, thank God, end of the national origin quota system that President Johnson helped accomplish. People from all parts of the world are coming. If you like, it tickles me every time. In New York City, every day, kids from 193 countries get up to go to schools. Now, New York City is not the only such city. If you really follow all across the cities, this is happening in all parts of our country. And so New York City is getting replicated. The issue is, are we up to this diversity? A very conservative thinker in this field called used to say that we have become the world's first universal society. And the issue is, are we up to this diversity? And here I tell you, I think we have great news, that while the rest of the world has sort of in the last few years seen evidence of tribalism, whether you see this in Europe, you see in Africa, you see in Asia, people who just are slightly different from each other, keep on fighting with each other. We actually have taken people from all those regions of the world. You could look at every conflict region of the world. We have taken people from those countries, we bring them to the United States, put them in Brooklyn, and they all seem to get along well. That there is something about the chemistry of immigration that I think it is uniquely transforming and uniquely American. As in the process of integration, of which many people here are better experts than I am, when immigrants come to this country, and this is not just recent, this has historically been our norm. Immigrants come and they change themselves. But in the process, they change ourselves and they change our own society. This is a two-way process in which the immigrants are constantly adding to the bloodstream of America in a way that nothing else does, which also makes us the unique country in the community of nations. Thank you.